This week, the Israel Connection returns to the Zoom sphere with a discussion including Doug Altabef, Chairman of the Board of Directors of Im Tirzu, whose motto is Building the Zionist Dream, Sam Tatarka, former Zionism Victoria President and Chairman of Beth Weizmann Community Centre in Melbourne, and myself. We examine the ABC World Today interview the CEO of the New Israel Fund, Liam Getreu, did recently, and the Zoom event with Martin Indyk that it hosted the previous day. I believe there is much in these two events that is wrong and warrants criticism. I invited Liam Getreu, the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund in Australia, to participate in this special program to defend the NIF's position and offer some accountability, but he hasn't responded. Before I go to the full interview with Doug Altabef from Im Tirzu and Sam Tatarka, I would just like to dissect the interview that Liam Getreu from the New Israel Fund gave on the ABC World Today program. So let me just play some selected clips from that interview, and I will make some comments following each clip that I play.
The important thing to realise is that this has been a dream of Israel's far right wing of the settler movement for many, many years now. They want to do everything they can to stop a two-state solution from occurring, and that, of course, would create a safe and secure Israel next to an independent and free Palestinian state as well. Annexation undermines that at almost every level. And so what we're looking at now is perhaps one of the last opportunities to bring us back to the founding goals of this two-state outcome.
Getreu pinned the wish to annex parts of Judea and Samaria onto the far-right settler movement. This shows how the NIF is aiming to label those who support any form of annexation as being from the far right. This is a total misrepresentation of the support base of those who may be supporting annexation in Israel and pure political nastiness by Getreu.
With this plan, which was put forward by Trump through his son-in-law Jared Kushner, what voice did the Palestinians have?
Well, almost none. They were pretty much excluded from the start, and it's because what we see this plan is really a negotiation between Israelis and Americans and not Israelis and Palestinians.
This assertion by Getreu that the Palestinians were excluded from the development of the Trump plan is an outright lie. As soon as the Palestinians got wind of what the plan contained, they have shunned it. It wasn't to their liking, so they complained rather than engaging in any kind of cooperative dialogue.
An annexation would double down on that. It would create effectively a permanent occupation of Palestinians, millions of Palestinians living in the West Bank without the ability to vote for the government that controls their lives, without basic human rights, basic civil rights. Annexation on almost any level, any kind of minimal plan or maximal plan, will create this permanent occupation, which is bad not just for Palestinians, obviously, but also for Israeli security, and it goes to the heart of Israel's democracy as well.
Getreu contends that if Israel declares sovereignty over certain parts of the West Bank, that the Palestinians living there will have no rights. Now, they might not end up being full citizens of Israel straight away, but there are many other statuses that they could have that would give them most of the privileges held by those who are full citizens. If a Palestinian state is ever created, they would logically become citizens there. One day they might even become full citizens of Israel if they can demonstrate their bona fides by respecting the state of Israel as a Jewish state.
The Israel Defense Force have been clear, according to reports, with the Prime Minister and the political establishment that they don't support annexation.
Getreu claims that the IDF as a whole opposes annexation. This statement is an outright lie. The IDF is not involved in making these kinds of decisions on political matters, and they don't speak out. They defend the country. They support whatever the government requires them to do. I'd also like to examine what transpired at the Zoom event with Martin Indyk that NIF Australia hosted, as there are also some very questionable things that were said at that event.
And of course, there's Donald Trump, a serial breaker of international agreements, who is now considering whether he should endorse a decision by Israel to break international law, Israel's commitments under the Oslo Accords, and Israel's commitment to UN Security Council Resolution 242. The Oslo Accords state very clearly that neither side shall take unilateral acts that affect the status of the territories. And UN Security Council Resolution 242 states very clearly in its preamble, as I'm sure you all know, that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by force.
Martin Indyk harps on about what might happen if Israel were to breach the Oslo Accords, but let's go back to 1996 when the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs listed the major PLO violations of the Oslo Accords already at that early stage. Firstly, the failure to change the PLO covenant. There was incitement to violence against Israel, as we know, with the violence that ensued after the Accords had been finalised. There's opening of fire on Israeli forces in September 1996 by Palestinian policemen during disturbances in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, which resulted in the deaths of 15 Israelis. There was failure to confiscate illegal arms and disarm and disband militias by the PA. There was a failure to extradite suspected terrorists to Israel. There was the opening of Palestinian Authority offices in Jerusalem when the PA was required to locate all offices and ministries exclusively in areas under its jurisdiction. There was the recruiting of terrorists to serve in the Palestinian police. There was an excessive number of police enlisted to the Palestinian police force, way above the numbers that were permitted under the Accords. There was abuse of human rights and the rule of law, and so the list goes on. But that doesn't concern Martin Indyk.
They put off the Jordan Valley annexation because that gets him into a world of grief with Jordan, endangers the peace treaty. Gantz is very much opposed to causing any problem for Jordan for strategic reasons, and because it's going to create a real problem for Israel's relations with at least some of the Gulf Arabs who are supporting Jordan, particularly the United Arab Emirates. And you probably saw recently the UAE ambassador in Washington, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, wrote an op-ed published on the front page of Yediot in Israel saying, Israelis, you like the normalization you're getting from us, well, you're going to have to choose annexation or normalization, but you can't have both.
We hear Martin Indyk fear-mongering about the danger for Israel of losing the support of important Arab states when Jordan is so dependent on Israel for water and gas and has the threat of major sanctions being brought upon it by the United States if it behaves in any way not considered to be appropriate by the United States and Israel. Not to mention as well that Jordan is not interested whatsoever in having a Palestinian state on its western border to threaten the viability of the Hashemite kingdom. And the comments by Al-Otaiba, the current UAE ambassador to the United States. He has remarked that there are plans to have an Abrahamic family house set up in Abu Dhabi, in the same complex as a mosque and a church. Last month he said that a new kosher caterer was launched in Dubai to serve the growing Jewish community, the first new community in the Arab world in more than a century, he continued. And he portrayed these gestures as carrots that had been provided in hopes of future peace, but said annexation would counter these efforts. Now, these have nothing to do with relations with Israel whatsoever. Any move on cutting back on these sorts of gestures towards the Jewish community should just be considered as anti-Semitic. And Israel should not be acquiescing to any blatant attacks of anti-Semitism whatsoever.
The opposite of annexation is separation. And this was Rabin's vision. You know, I'm so angry to see Derma invoke Rabin's speech, the last speech he gave, to somehow justify this project, which is the opposite of what Rabin intended. Rabin's whole program was to separate from the Palestinians. And the words that I will always remember him saying was at the signing of the Oslo II agreement, in which he said, our task is to separate, not out of hatred, but out of respect.
Martin Indyk refers to the darling of the left, Yitzhak Rabin, but he doesn't face up to the fact that Yitzhak Rabin never envisaged a Palestinian state being formed in Judea and Samaria. He imagined some kind of autonomy for the Palestinians. Rabin was always formally opposed to the creation of a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria.
So far, we're talking about words. What do you think they will push further, push for some kind of action? Do you think either Jewish communities, I know in Great Britain there are Jewish communities pushing the Johnson administration, to the Johnson government, to do something more than just express opposition to it because of all the reasons you outlined? Do you think they'll go further either in international forums, maybe around differentiation of products between products produced inside Israel proper versus those from the West Bank settlements?
In these inflammatory remarks by Getreu, he is virtually inciting Jewish communities to find ways to battle against Israel's interests by supporting those who are against annexation. And in this very mischievous vein, Getreu has been exhorting our Jewish community leaders here in Australia to declare where they stand on the question of annexation, which is a divisive gesture driving a wedge into the cohesion of our Jewish community. So I'm delighted to welcome Doug Altabef, the chairman of the board of directors of Im Tirzu, whose motto is Building the Zionist Dream, and Sam Tatarka, former Zionism Victoria president and chairman of Beth Weizmann Community Centre, to the Israel Connection. And today we're going to be discussing an interview that the CEO of the New Israel Fund did on the ABC World Today program on Wednesday, the 24th of June, and a Zoom event with Martin Indyk that the NIF hosted on the day before, Tuesday, the 23rd of June. I believe there is much in these two events that is wrong and warrants criticism. I invited Liam Getreu, the executive director of the New Israel Fund in Australia, to join this discussion, but unsurprisingly, I haven't heard anything from him. So, Doug, to start off with, Im Tirzu in certain circles is considered a right-winged organisation. Now, when Getreu spoke on the ABC World Today, he pinned the wish to annex parts of Judea and Samaria onto the far-right settler movement. Now, this seems to show that the NIF is aiming to label those who support any form of annexation as being from the far right in order to marginalise them. Is this not total misrepresentation of the support base for annexation and dirty political opportunism by Getreu?
Well, sure. It is one of many, many misrepresentations, very clever, deceptive misrepresentations that he engaged in. Surveys show that there is a consensus of opinion within Israel to apply some sort of sovereignty, and we can get into a discussion of what that might entail. But there is no question that issues having to do with the security from having the Jordan Valley under our control and also ultimately our sovereignty are consensual issues in Israel. It's very important for your viewers, for your readers, to really know who the New Israel Fund is, because it's one thing to dissect what they say, but it's very important to take, if I might, a step back and look at what they are all about. Because one of the things that my organization has done very successfully in Israel is to make sure that the citizens of Israel have a much better sense of what the NIF is, what their agenda is, what their priorities are. The NIF has been around since 1979, so they're not a new organization, and much of what they do is fairly, what we'd say, fairly parva, hospitals, schools, things of that sort. But a great deal of their budget is devoted to supporting anti-Zionist organizations here in Israel. Many of those organizations get the bulk of their financing from European governments, and they have an agenda that ranges from supporting BDS to and this next one is very near and dear to the hearts of the NIF, having Israel stop being a Jewish state and become a state of its citizens. Now, for many of your viewers and listeners, that might be shocking, but it is very clearly part of their agenda. So they support organizations like Adala, which want to end the Hatikva and the Jewish flag, the Israeli flag, and national holidays. And so that kind of priority suffuses a lot of their particular position papers. So when I watched that interview, there were a great number of references to the horrors of the last 10 years, because Israel has had a right-leaning government for the last 10 years. So of course, that's anathema to them. But to your point, yes, there's no question that sovereignty in Israel is viewed consensually. Remember the Alon plan, Yigal Alon, who was a Mapai, a Labor Party minister. The plan was that Israel must control the Jordan Valley. So this has been going on for many, many decades. This is nothing new, and it's certainly part and parcel of the way Israelis look at their future.
Im Tirzu is a non-profit movement dedicated to strengthening and nurturing the values of Zionism in Israel. Im Tirzu's main objectives focus on working towards renewing positive Zionist discourse, thinking and ideology, ensuring the future of the Jewish nation and of the State of Israel, and advancing Israeli society in coping with the challenges it faces. Here we have a video which tells us about the activities of Im Tirzu.
The worldwide delegitimization of Israel is growing daily. False claims of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid are being used to justify boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. To the surprise of many, these same tactics are being applied within Israel itself in a deliberate attempt to undermine the Zionist dream of a Jewish and democratic state from within. This effort is not being led by Israel's Arab neighbors. It is being led by Israeli organizations that are receiving extensive funding from foreign entities such as the European Union, individual European governments, and the American-based New Israel Fund. While many of these NGOs claim that they are supporting Israel, their actions tell a very different story. These organizations launched a battle of ideas aimed at convincing the Israeli public that their country has no right to exist as a Jewish state. But instead of declaring this outright, they have cleverly adopted a strategy of gradual attack and condemnation, with the goal that Israel will eventually surrender to this destructive indoctrination. For example, there are groups that claim Israel is ethnically cleansing the Bedouin Muslims from the Negev, groups that claim Israel has an apartheid policy in Judea and Samaria, and groups that accuse the IDF of committing war crimes in Gaza. Inside Israel, the result of this propaganda is public loss of faith in the justice of Zionism. The slow erosion in the will to fight for a Jewish state means that the miraculous rebirth of a sovereign Jewish people could crumble from within without even a single shot being fired. Fortunately, the threat to Israel's Zionist and Jewish character is being challenged. In just a few years, Im Tirzu has risen to become one of Israel's most visible and outspoken defenders of Zionism. Today, in a unique grassroots network with branches on Israel's campuses, Im Tirzu cultivates Zionist leaders for the sake of Israel's future. Im Tirzu works in two primary ways. First, it strengthens the belief in the justice and the importance of the Zionist cause. This effort might include lectures on campuses, along with the contributions of non-Jewish minorities to the State of Israel. Second, Im Tirzu opposes those foreign-funded organizations that seek to delegitimize Israel. Im Tirzu has built an extensive network of more than 6,000 volunteers in Israel and have been actively involved with some of the most important recent efforts to combat Israel's delegitimization.
When the Goldstone report accused Israel of making war crimes and crimes against humanity, it was Im Tirzu that exposed that 18 radical anti-Israeli organizations, all funded from the New Israel Fund, provided the information. In fact, all those organizations were one.
Im Tirzu also initiated the campaign to expose these organizations who were advocating the prosecution of IDF officials in foreign courts. Im Tirzu has also published reports that have revealed anti-Zionist bias in academia, including the highly publicized bias of the political science department at Ben-Gurion University.
During Operation Protective Edge, hundreds of Im Tirzu volunteers flocked to the south of Israel to help residents file UN petitions against Hamas for their war crimes.
These activities have had a solid impact on both Israeli society and the Israeli government, where Im Tirzu is highly regarded.
I welcome the activity of Im Tirzu, of young students who have taken upon themselves spontaneously to begin to return these Zionist values into academia, into public discourse, into public life in Israel. The fact that thousands of students have gathered together, secular and religious alike, for reclaiming and restoring the Zionist ideals, I think this is a great development, one that I support, one that has been long overdue in this country, and one that I think you should support wholeheartedly and generously. Thank you.
It is no coincidence that Im Tirzu was asked to head the steering committee for the Knesset's caucus on delegitimization of Israel. Im Tirzu has no choice. It must grow, because the enemies of Zionism and Israel relentlessly seek to intensify their destructive efforts. In order to continue to defend Zionism and Israel, Im Tirzu needs to attract even more strong and helpful partners. We invite you to become one of them.
The video showed a background of the work of Im Tirzu. Although the video is a few years old, I think it's very representative of what the ethos of Im Tirzu is. Going back to the interview that Liam Getreu did, would you suggest that perhaps the NIF is using scare tactics to frighten people away from supporting annexation? What do you think about that one, Sam?
It's interesting. My own view is that NIF is not playing specifically, at least in Australia, is not playing specifically to the Jewish community. I think that there's a fair degree of setting themselves up as an alternate voice, as they would see it, speaking a lot to media and making the position that they represent a significant body of opinion amongst Australian Jewry as to things that go on in Israel. I don't have the data that would support a call one way or the other as to how many members they have and how many people they actually represent, or for that matter, how big their donor base is. But clearly they are an articulate and worrying, to some extent, force that operates, as we saw in Liam's interview on the ABC News, that operates to cloud the issues and to put a particular political position. I don't think the NIF is playing effectively with a neutral bat. They approach these issues from their political standpoint. Their interviews reflect that standpoint. The discussion that Liam hosted with Martin Indyk the night before is similar in tone. They are essentially talking to their own base and reinforcing the views or policies that they believe ought to be in effect. And in particular, this question of annexation, I think, has been blown up out of all proportion by NIF and those who are seeking to undermine the exercise of Israeli sovereignty over parts of the West Bank. I think it's terribly important to understand some of the things that are being spoken about are really things that there is no serious controversy. Ma'ale Adumim is one of those things about which there can't be any serious controversy, nor can there be a serious controversy about Pisgat Zev, nor can there be a controversy about the Gush Etzion bloc. There is on any view, even Martin Indyk's view, and I'm pretty sure if Liam was prepared to admit it, on Liam's view, these suburbs or towns or large places of Israeli settlement and residence are never ever going to be part of a Palestinian state, and continuing to hold them in suspension for decade after decade after decade ultimately is counterproductive. And I think that there's a very significant case for making some of the hard realities on the ground exactly that. They are realities on the ground. So instead of dancing around these issues, why don't we just actually deal with the issues? I thought I'm sorry if I'm going on too long, but I thought one of the very interesting points that Martin Indyk made in his interview was about the Palestinian right of return. Now, the Palestinians hold their right of return as holy writ. There isn't a Palestinian leader who's prepared to stand up and say there won't actually be a return of millions or anything like that of Palestinians living outside of Israel into territory controlled by Israel in any conceivable peace deal that might ultimately be concluded. And Indyk would be one of those who would stand very strongly and talk about the right of return. But interestingly, in his interview, he kind of let slip the idea that really what we're talking about is some symbolic few thousand Palestinians being admitted into Israel as some symbolic method of showing a Palestinian right of return without there actually being a serious right of return. In my view, one of the biggest problems we have with this peace process is that we don't actually articulate the fact that some of these dreams of the Palestinians are utter fantasies that will never be realised. And until such time as there is a more realistic assessment of what the options are, there won't be a deal concluded. And this is just part of the process of speaking reality, in my view.
Sam, that's a great point. And I think that when you focus on the wishful thinking aspect of what Getreu was saying, the dream of the two-state solution, the dream of the two-state solution could have been effected decades ago if the Palestinians actually showed up and engaged in serious goodwill negotiations. Why is this idea, as you point out, why is this issue of annexation, which is a terrible word, by the way, because annexation connotes that you took something, you stole something, you took something that was not yours. There is no issue of annexation here because the territories that we're talking about were stateless, and they were won by Israel in a defensive war in 1967. In the 18 years that Jordan controlled them, no nation other than Pakistan recognized Jordanian sovereignty over what they would call the West Bank, and what in Israel is widely referred to as Judea and Samaria. So the idea of annexation is a construct designed to skew the entire discussion, to make it look like somehow Israel's been caught with its fingers in the cookie jar, and are we going to let it get away with this? So when the NIF fellow starts talking about, oh my goodness, ending the dream of the two-state solution, there is no dream of a two-state solution, or I should say there is only a dream because there is no reality behind the idea of a two-state solution, because anyone who studies the Palestinian Authority, certainly studies Hamas, reads what they're actually writing in Arabic, and here's where Palestinian Media Watch does a great job, knows very clearly that there is still very much a replacement ideology involved. In other words, that the solution is replacing the state of Israel with Palestine. And that is why, as you point out correctly, Sam, no leader will countenance the end of the right of return, because generations of Palestinians have been taught to hold that little key in their hands, remember their parents' houses in Sfat and in Haifa and in Baka, wherever, and they're going back. They're going to go back. And, you know, the only way they can go back is if we leave. And last I looked, we were not of a mindset to be leaving. So the idea that there could be a two-state solution presumes some kind of comedy with a T, not a D, some kind of agreement to end the state of warfare, a great degree of acceptance of the reality of Israel. None of that is there. None of that is there. One of the biggest howlers in Getreu's interview was when he said, you know what? Palestinians weren't even involved in the negotiations. It was a negotiation between Trump and the Israelis. I said, that, for people who don't know, that is a highly manipulative, deceptive statement. Because anyone who knows anything knows Palestinians completely boycotted the whole process, refused to show up, would have nothing to do with it, put a curse on Trump and his administration. So it is so cynical to turn around and say, gee, they weren't even involved. It would be laughable if it wasn't so deceptive.
Also, in that vein of misleading people who are listening to them, Martin Indyk mentioned that the Palestinian state will be demilitarized. And when he said that it would be unlike any other state in existence, according to him. Now, this gives the false impression that the Palestinians are making special concessions to make peace with Israel. But of course, if one does a little bit of thinking, one discovers that Andorra, Costa Rica, Liechtenstein, the Vatican, Samoa, Nauru, Kiribati, plus another half a dozen countries that maintain limited paramilitary security forces don't have a military, are not militarized. So here is another example of misleading information.
And in fact, David, perhaps a more relevant parallel might be that when the United States defeated Japan in the Second World War, Japan was held to be a non-militarized state for a large number of years until the Americans could be satisfied that they no longer posed a threat to world order. And there's no doubt in my mind that Israel would be absolutely insane if it consented to a militarized Palestinian state in the current state of affairs. We're talking, I would have thought, in the event that a Palestinian state is actually established in part of what is called the West Bank, a long period of demilitarization, followed hopefully by normalization, and ultimately generations down the track with Palestinian leaders who are talking to their people about peaceful coexistence in reality, then that could lead, if there was ever a need demonstrated for it, to a more militarized force. But the argument to militarize the Palestinians is a bizarre argument, and in particular a bizarre argument when you look at what Hamas has done in Gaza. I mean, that's a militarized Palestinian state. It's brought us 3 wars, at least.
Right. David, you could give Andorra the hydrogen bomb and its neighbors would not be losing sleep at night because they're not posing a threat. Giving anything to the Palestinians by way of weaponry poses, as Sam mentioned, poses an immediate threat. And so the demilitarization doesn't come from nowhere. It's respecting the reality of what the facts on the ground have been in terms of intifadas, in terms of launching terror attacks. There is a history here, and certainly Hamas, as Sam mentioned, is a great case in point in terms of here was Israel unilaterally leaving with the naive expectation that this would bring a Edenic state of quiet, and it, of course, it geometrically, if not exponentially, increased the amount of rocket fire, the amount of violence coming from Hamas. The Gaza is one of the most heavily armed places in the world today. So it would be suicidal to want to replicate that on Israel's other border.
The NIF in Australia, as you'd be aware, has been badgering the Australian government to declare publicly its position on Israel about the annexation of any part of the West Bank. Now, do you think it's appropriate for a fringe group like the NIF to be demanding that the Australian government speak out on this issue at this time?
Well, let's parse through what is the real problem. If you say that the idea of applying sovereignty here is pursuant to the Trump peace plan, which anticipates that Israel will have sovereignty over a certain portion of Judea and Samaria, Palestinians, subject to conditions, will have sovereignty over the balance of it. So if this is all in the cards, and as you pointed out, the idea, Male Adamim, with 45,000 Israeli Jews living in it, the Gush bloc with over 100,000 Jews living at Ariel with 40,000, they're not, what are they going to do? They're going to be evacuated? Of course not. So these are obviously, in any peace agreement, going to be part and parcel of the state of Israel. They are already part and parcel of the state of Israel. So this is being, annexation is being waved around like apartheid is waved around. It's a boogeyman phrase. It's like ooga booga booga, annexation, ooga booga booga, you become an apartheid state. And it is a dog whistle, so to speak, to get people very upset and get them to very predictably start screaming and rending their clothes. But the reality is that this is all per a common sense plan that is predicated on the history of plans that have gone nowhere because they have not been rooted in a sense of reality. This plan, you can quibble with it, you can argue with it, but there is a fundamental appreciation of reality that attaches to it, and the application of sovereignty is a direct outgrowth of that understanding of reality.
The question that I posed, we're talking about the Australian context here, so you may not be so aware, Doug, of what I'm talking about. It's a bit, it's been intriguing, and there's been a lot of opinion voiced especially from the Labor Party and their friends about the fact that the Australian government hasn't declared its hand. Now, what do you think about the Australian government remaining silent on this when so many other governments have spoken out?
Sometimes silence is the best answer, but it seems to me that not everybody, because I think it's far more nuanced than all of them and all of us. It's a much more nuanced discussion than that. But the risk that one has in piling on one way or the other before you actually see what's been articulated is that you really are not understanding, I think, and not addressing what is actually happening. Now, Indyk says that if 30% of the West, if Israel applies sovereignty to 30% of the West Bank, something like 11 or 12,000 Palestinians, because of the way they would carve out that application of sovereignty, may ultimately find themselves living in an area which is now under Israeli sovereignty. One of the biggest complaints that one hears from the Palestinian side of this debate is the fact that Israel occupies Palestinian territory and grants no rights to Palestinians who live under its occupation, whereas if this application of sovereignty is done properly and fairly, in my view, you would have those Palestinians resident in Israeli sovereign territory have to have a pathway to citizenship and equal rights. I mean, part of, I think, what Indyk said, or at least Getreu said, is this idea of second-class citizens. Now, the second class, which is not really second class, it's a separate proposition, because Israel has failed to apply sovereignty, Palestinians are under the rules of military rules, because Israel controls those areas as part of what it took in a defensive war. If civilian law is applied to those areas, then the argument for keeping Palestinians who live there in suspension is far less persuasive. In fact, in my view, almost unsustainable. You would have to allow the people who live there to acquire rights as citizens, as you have many other hundreds of thousands of Arab citizens who have rights in Israel, who are equal citizens in Israel. They're not second-class citizens. They are equal citizens in Israel, the same rights to vote, to receive benefits. They have all of those rights. If those rights are applied to the people living in the area where Israel has applied its sovereignty, then that's a major step forward for those people who are being held in this 63-year-old, 53-year-old limbo created by the non-resolution of the post-1967 reality on the ground. We've been dancing around this for decades. It's about time somebody took a forward step.
Do you want to say something about that, Doug? Whether you believe that citizenship should be granted to Palestinians in Israeli sovereign territory?
First of all, you know, we're dealing with such a skewed deck here. The state of Palestine would be Judenrein. No Jews would be allowed to live in it. Areas A and B today are Judenrein. There are signs when you approach them that you are subject to arrest if an Israeli citizen dares to cross into them. So the idea of applying rights to people, any Israelis, any settlements that might fall be contained within what would be Palestinian territory, would not become Palestinian citizens. The idea of these Palestinians living in areas where sovereignty is applied is that they will become citizens of the state of Palestine. They will have citizenship. It will be Palestinian citizenship. Sam makes a very good point, and that is the application of Israeli civil law. Even if you're not a citizen, there are many non-citizens who live in Israel today, and they live with rights. They live with human rights. They live with civil rights. They don't have the right to vote, just as the people in Puerto Rico don't have the right to vote in a national election in the United States or in Guam. There are also situations in sovereign countries where some people who have rights don't have rights of voting, don't have full citizenship rights. That's something to be worked out. But the idea that however many of these Palestinians who would be living in areas where Israeli civil law would be applied, Sam makes a very good point. They'd be in much better shape than living under the current military law. Because, again, Israeli civil law is very gracious to all people, citizens and non-citizens, on fundamental human rights.
Okay, now let's leave this subject, because I wanted to ask you both now. This is in relation to the NIF in Australia having started a petition which they have directed at our Australian Jewish community leadership to demand that they take an active stand and make their position against annexation known. Now, this is the kind of activism, I think, which is very questionable and not in the interests of any Jewish community. I'm aware that one of the leaders of the Zionist Federation in England put out a declaration about his opinion, and the different factions that are under the umbrella of the Zionist Federation got a bit shirty about that. So what do you make of this sort of a move, actually calling upon the Jewish community? And I would point out that in Getreu's interview with Indyk, he was putting a suggestion to him that the Jewish community in Britain should be exhorted to support Boris Johnson's government in its stated position on any move by Israel towards annexation. So I don't think that it's appropriate for the NIF to be carrying out its activities in this kind of a fashion.
Asking governments of other countries to pile on pressure into Israel not to go ahead with its plans to apply sovereignty, in my view, is ultimately unhelpful. It's counterproductive. It's just, they shouldn't be doing it.
Here's a suggestion. Why don't you two start your own petition exhorting the Jewish community to support the idea that it is up to the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves to determine what is in their ultimate interests. And when other governments weigh in, or other communities weigh in, they're doing so with much less knowledge, with much less skin in the game, and it's somewhat gratuitous. It would be like my saying, I'm going to be actively telling the Jewish community of Australia how the government of Australia should be treating the Maori community. I mean, where do I come off doing that? I don't know anything about the relationships. I don't know anything about the context. And yet, there is this sanctimoniousness. There is this we know better than you. We're saving you from yourself aspect of, this is what the NIF is famous for. And they are ginning up other people who are very happy to opine. They have no awareness of anything, but they're very happy to tell us exactly what it is we should or should not be doing.
Correct. I completely agree.
So, what sort of accountability, though, then does the New Israel Fund? I know that you, Doug, attempted to speak to the head of the NIF a couple of years ago. I think you've engaged with Daniel Sokach. Is that correct? Is it appropriate for organisations like this to only speak to people that are friendly to them? They don't seem to want to enter any arena where they're going to be seriously challenged.
Right. No, the NIF has their talking points. They have their agenda, and they don't want facts to get in the way of it. And they're very good at being very on message, and particularly when people such as I'm going to presume many of the Jewish community in Australia are not necessarily well versed in the minutiae of what's going on in Israel. And so when you use buzz terms like, you're not being fair, you're shutting out the dream, you're closing down the dream, you're denying human rights, it's like, wow, well, that seems problematic. This is part of a tactic that is widely being used against Israel by BDS organizations. By the way, the NIF has an exquisitely delicate policy about BDS. They said, we don't support BDS, but we will not support any grantee organizations that in turn do support BDS. In other words, it's a see no evil, hear no evil type of policy about it. And they want to be able to have their cake and eat it too. So to my way of thinking, there is a great deal of hypocrisy here. There is a great deal of virtue signaling here, sanctimony here. And I would hope, I grew up in America. And in America, Australians were widely regarded as really tachlis people, that they just got it. They were not people that you could, sort of flim-flam. They were really grounded people. That was always the image of Australia. And so I would hope that the Australian Jewish community is still true to that kind of sensibility and knows when they are being played. And the NIF is trying to play your community like a fiddle.
So just to wrap things up, do you want to have a last word, Sam, on what do you think is the threat of the New Israel Fund today, especially in our own community?
Look, I think the concern that one would have about organisations like the New Israel Fund are effectively what Doug has just articulated, which is being sold a bill of goods without necessarily knowing what the reality is on the ground. I think the absolute key to being in a position to evaluate what you're being told is to inform oneself from as many sources as possible as to what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, I've had the privilege of touring Jerusalem in the past with delegations of Victorian parliamentarians who have come on fact-finding missions. There is nothing so enlightening as to watch the light bulb go on in a politician's mind when you show them exactly what we're talking about in terms of the juxtaposition of Palestinian areas with Israeli areas, just how close and intimately Arabs and Jews live together in Israel, mostly, I'm very pleased to say, without conflict. It's a great shame that this kind of positive on the ground stuff is not what's being spoken about, and that the true reality of, for example, this annexation or sovereignty debate is being focused on the Gewalt and Geschrei of what might happen if Israel annexed the whole of the West Bank in circumstances where it has absolutely no intention of annexing the whole of the West Bank. What we're talking about, at least in the foreseeable future, is, as I said at the very beginning of my comments in this discussion, is putting the stamp of reality on what's actually there. Malay Adumim, Pisgat Zev, the Gush, that's what we're talking about right now. Those things are never going to be part of the Palestinian state. Anybody who's ever been there would recognize that reality on the ground. And I think people need to inform themselves and be educated so that when they hear things from NIF, or from anybody really, they have a capacity to evaluate the information against the knowledge base that they've acquired for themselves. Information, more than ever, is king, and in particular, information from diverse sources, so you can make judgments about what you think the real story is rather than being sold a story.
Sam is 200% right, but we're all of a certain generation here, and what we may not understand is that we now live in a world where facts no longer matter compared to your feelings, compared to your narrative. And that's a frightening situation, because Sam is absolutely right that when people see, and I have had the same experience, when people understand, Groucho Marx once famously said, "What are you going to believe? What I tell you, or what's right in front of your own eyes?" So when people see what's right in front of their own eyes in Israel, and as Sam said, a light bulb goes off, it is cathartic. And we have to keep reminding people of the reality of the situation, inviting people to see it for themselves, to learn more about it, and to take a very skeptical, and this is a key thing, and David, you've done a real service to your community by having Sam and I on today, to take a very skeptical attitude towards those who would come on and start to demonize and denigrate the situation for their own purposes.
Well, thank you both indeed for participating in this little discussion today on the Israel Connection. And I'm, as I say, I'm very appreciative, and I think that this is a message that we're delivering that will get out to our community and those others who are interested in these issues, so they can see what the New Israel Fund goes about doing, and be a bit more critical in terms of their take on the message delivered by the New Israel Fund to the community and to our own community and to the wider community. Thank you both.
Thank you, David, for the opportunity. Thank you, Doug. All the very best.
Sam, nice to meet you virtually, and David, thank you for the time.